The day Marcus Webb became CEO, he divorced his wife. Not metaphorically, not eventually. That morning, the same morning the Nexagen Pharmaceuticals press release went out, the same morning his name was printed beneath the word Chief Executive Officer for the first time, a process server knocked on the door of the Chicago townhouse Caroline had kept running for 12 years and handed her a manila envelope and waited politely while she signed for it. She was still wearing her hospital bracelet. She had been discharged the previous afternoon. 2 days of monitoring after a cardiac event her husband had described to his assistant as a minor thing, nothing serious. And the bruise from her IV line was still visible on the back of her left hand as she accepted the envelope and signed and closed the door without a word. What that process server could not have known, what Marcus Webb, newly minted CEO, celebrating across town with his board, his mother Gloria's hand proud on his arm, and Renata Solis managing the press from the back of the room, what none of them could have known was that 40 minutes earlier, a single email had arrived in Caroline's inbox from her late father's estate attorney, and attached to that email was a shareholder register. And on that register, in the column marked Controlling Authority over Executive Leadership, was Caroline's name, not Marcus's, hers. He had just divorced the only person whose signature made his title real. This is not just a story about a man who discarded his wife on the best day of his life. It's a story about what a father quietly built for his daughter while no one was paying attention, and what happens when the bill finally comes due. If you believe that patience is its own kind of power, hit that like button and subscribe. This channel is for you. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We are in every country, every time zone, every kitchen, and every commute. Now, to understand what Caroline did next, we need to go back to where all of this truly began. To understand what happened that morning, we need to go back to where this really began. Not to the board vote, not to the announcement dinner the night before, where Caroline had sat at the far end of a table in a room full of people who had known her for a decade and looked through her like glass. Not even to the hospital, where she had spent 2 days being monitored by a cardiologist named Dr. Priya Mehta, while her husband sent a fruit basket and his assistant's phone number. We need to go back to a Sunday afternoon in February, 3 months before Edmund Alderman died, when Howard Finch drove to Evanston and sat across from Edmund at his kitchen table and spread out a set of documents that Edmund signed with the blue pen he always kept in his shirt pocket. Caroline was not in the room. Edmund had not told her what he was doing. He had simply called her that evening after Howard left and said, "I've made a change to the trust. You'll know when to use it." She hadn't asked. That was the thing about her father. He said what he meant, and she had learned over 41 years that his sentences were complete. You'll know when to use it, not a riddle, a confidence. She knew now. The kitchen was quiet around her. Marcus had not come home the previous night. She had not expected him to. The announcement dinner had run late, and there were, she understood, other arrangements. The house held the particular silence of a space that has been emptying for months and has finally admitted it. Morning light came through the window above the sink at a low angle, catching the edge of the manila envelope on the table, the edge of the Finch and Delaney correspondence beside it, and the steam rising from the mug she had made without thinking. The way her hands still knew this kitchen even when the rest of her had begun to leave it. She was still in yesterday's clothes. The hospital bracelet sat on her left wrist, white and clinical and slightly too loose, the way they always were. The bruise from the IV line had gone greenish at the edges, a wide soft continent on the back of her hand. She had meant to cut the bracelet off the previous morning and had not gotten around to it. And then the process server had knocked, and after that it had seemed beside the point. She pulled the trust documents toward her. She did not need to read them. She had read them 14 times in the past 6 weeks, often late at night at this same table, often with the same mug growing cold at her elbow. But she read them again now, carefully, the way she had been trained as a corporate attorney to read anything that mattered. Not skimming for reassurance, reading for precision. The Class A founder's share of Nexagen Pharmaceuticals, held in the Alderman Family Trust, beneficial ownership transferred to Caroline Ruth Alderman Webb as sole successor trustee, effective upon the death of Edmund George Alderman. Irrevocable, perpetual, final and binding authority over executive leadership and strategic direction. The board had voted at 2:17 in the afternoon. Marcus had been CEO for 14 hours. He did not know. That was the fact she returned to, the way a tongue returns to a loose tooth. Not from pain, but from the strange, persistent reality of it. He had spent 3 years engineering a vote. He had attended 47 board meetings. He had cultivated relationships and managed optics and constructed a narrative of visionary leadership so carefully and so completely that he had convinced a room full of intelligent people and, she suspected, himself. And in the moment the vote was confirmed, in the moment he stood and accepted the congratulations of men who had eaten at her table, the title he received belonged to him at her sufferance only. He had been CEO for 14 hours of a company she controlled, and he had spent those 14 hours celebrating and arranging for divorce papers to be delivered to a woman still wearing a hospital bracelet, and he did not know. The irony was not sharp. It was enormous and quiet, the way real things are. She thought about what her father had said, standing in the Nexagen lobby when she was 9 years old, holding her hand and showing her a framed copy of the 1987 incorporation document mounted beside the reception desk. The name that signs the founding document is the name the building remembers, sweetheart. She hadn't understood it then. She had understood it to mean something about legacy, about perseverance, about the gap between the people who build things and the people who inherit the credit. She understood it differently now. She had not made a rash decision. That mattered to her, not because she was calculating, but because she was not. 6 weeks of sitting with knowledge this significant and saying nothing, and attending the board vote in a navy dress and applauding was not strategy. It was the behavior of a woman who wanted to be certain she was acting from the right place before she acted at all. Her father had not built what he built by moving quickly. He had built it by being sure. She was sure now. She set the trust documents down beside the manila envelope, aligning their edges without thinking. Her father's handwriting was on one of them. The process server's receipt was on the other. The distance between those two pieces of paper was the whole story. She picked up her phone, not to call anyone, just to check the time. It was 7:43 in the morning. She had a call with Howard Finch at 9. Edmund Alderman was not a man who became things gradually. He decided, and then he did. That quality, the gap between deciding and doing being almost nothing, was the first thing people noticed about him and the last thing they forgot. He had been a pharmacist for 11 years, working a counter on Dempster Street in Evanston, compounding prescriptions and reading every pharmaceutical patent filing he could access. When he decided that the compound he kept adjusting for a particular class of oncology patients could be stabilized into something reproducible at scale, he did not talk about the idea for long. He called Howard Finch, who was then 35 and newly in practice, and he said, "I need to incorporate a company." Howard asked him what kind. Edmund said, "The kind that lasts." Nexagen Pharmaceuticals was incorporated in Chicago on March 14, 1987. Edmund signed the founding documents with the same blue pen he carried in his shirt pocket every day of his working life. A Waterman ballpoint, navy ink, given to him by his wife Margaret on their wedding day. Howard drafted the charter, and in the charter, on the advice of a corporate attorney named Gerald Strauss, who had read enough founding documents to know what founders always forgot to protect, Edmund retained the Class A founder's share, a single certificated instrument, no economic value, absolute authority over executive leadership, company sale, and charter amendment in perpetuity. Gerald Strauss called it unusual. Edmund called it obvious. He signed it without hesitation and put the charter in a 3-ring binder that went on the shelf in his home office in Evanston, where it would sit, gathering the particular authority of patient documents for the next 36 years. Caroline was 9 years old when he first took her to the Nexagen offices on West Wacker Drive. The company was 5 years old and already outgrowing its second lease. Edmund walked her through the lobby and stopped at the framed copy of the incorporation document mounted beside the reception desk. A habit she would understand later, not a coincidence. He crouched to her height, which he always did when he wanted her to remember something, and he said, The name that signs the founding document is the name the building remembers, sweetheart. Everything else is just noise. She didn't fully understand it then. She understood it to be about permanence, about the difference between the people who plant things and the people who arrive later and stand in the shade. She stored it the way children store the things adults say, with particular weight, not yet comprehensible, but intact, waiting. The scene softened into something quieter when she turned 12 and then 15, and then went to Northwestern for her undergraduate degree, and then to law school at the University of Chicago, where she studied corporate law with the focused attention of someone who had grown up watching a corporation built from a pharmacist's counter and a blue pen. Edmund never pushed her toward the company. He simply showed her how it worked and let her decide what she wanted to do with the knowing. What the audience should hold on to through everything that follows is this. Caroline Alderman was trained to read founding documents. She knew what they meant. She knew what they protected. And when Marcus Webb arrived in her life, she was more equipped to understand what her father had built than Marcus ever suspected or she ever said aloud. Marcus joined Nexagen in the autumn of 2011, brought in as a director of corporate strategy by a board that Edmund had quietly recommended him to after meeting him at a conference in San Francisco. Edmund saw in him something he recognized, a man of genuine intelligence who had not yet found the right architecture to put it in. He mentored him, had him to dinner, introduced him to the board not as a favor, but as a judgment, which Edmund's judgments usually were. By the spring of 2013, Marcus and Caroline had been together for 18 months, and Edmund, watching from what he would later describe only as a concerned distance, had asked Howard Finch to ensure that the Alderman Family Trust's Class A instrument was formally ring-fenced as separate property before any wedding. Howard did so. Marcus was never told. There was no prenuptial conversation about it because there was no conversation at all. It was simply structured correctly, quietly in advance, the way Edmund structured everything that mattered. The early marriage was real. That is important. Marcus Webb at 34 was not a villain. He was a man in love with a woman he admired and grateful to a father-in-law who had believed in him before he had fully believed in himself. He was warm in those years. He asked Caroline's opinion and meant it. He brought Edmund coffee when they worked late and listened when Edmund talked about the company's founding years with the genuine attention of someone trying to understand, not just to inherit. Caroline was happy. Not performed happy, not adjusted happy, but the uncomplicated embodied happiness of a woman who had married someone she trusted. A memory surfaced, later, of a dinner in their first apartment on North State Street. The good dishes, candles, Edmund and his wife Margaret across the table, Marcus making Edmund laugh until he took his glasses off to wipe his eyes. Caroline had watched her father laugh and thought, I chose correctly. She had been right about that once. The tragedy is that she had been right. The seed of what came later was visible, if anyone had been looking. Marcus would occasionally go quiet after Edmund praised him. A particular quality of quiet, contained and watchful, the way a man goes quiet when a compliment lands somewhere complicated. He had built his career on his own effort and intelligence, and Edmund's belief in him was a gift he could not entirely receive without also feeling the weight of what it implied. He was in a house another man had built. He was good at living in it. He was not always comfortable with what that meant. Edmund fell ill in the autumn of 2022. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, diagnosed in October. He told Caroline first, then Margaret, then Howard Finch. He told Marcus over the phone 3 days later, and the conversation was brief. Marcus said the right things. Then he went back to work. In February of the following year, Edmund called Caroline into his study in Evanston, the room where the 3-ring binder still sat on its shelf, and told her he had made a change to the trust. She looked at him. He was thinner than he had been at Christmas, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead in the old habit, the blue pen in his breast pocket. He held her eyes for a moment and said, "You'll know when to use it." She didn't ask what it was. She understood from the precision of his voice that it would be findable when she needed it, and that asking for more detail than he offered would have been an insult to the clarity he always gave her. He died in May 2023. The service was at a church on Ridge Avenue in Evanston, full of people who had known him through 3 decades of building something real. The flowers were white. Margaret sat very straight in the front row. Caroline sat beside her and held her hand and did not look away from the casket. Marcus gave the eulogy. He was composed and eloquent and positioned himself, in the gentle grammar of tribute, as the natural inheritor of Edmund's vision, the man Edmund had believed in, the man who would carry the work forward. He used Edmund's name 12 times. He used Caroline's name once, in a clause about family, flanked on either side by more important sentences. Caroline listened to every word. Her hands were still in her lap. The blue pen was in the casket, per Margaret's instruction, tucked into the breast pocket of Edmund's suit. The name that signs the founding document is the name the building remembers. Everything else is just noise. The grief, when it settled, was not what Caroline had expected. She had expected it to be loud, a thing that announced itself in waves. The way grief was described in the books her therapist, Dr. Sandra Osei, kept on the shelf in her office on North Michigan Avenue. What she found instead was that it lived in the small registers, in the way she still reached for her phone at 10 in the morning to call her father's landline, in the way she caught herself calculating how long the drive to Evanston would take before remembering there was no longer a reason to go. Marcus handled Edmund's absence the way he handled most inconvenient things, by moving forward quickly enough that looking back became impractical. The change in the marriage was not sudden. It did not arrive with a confrontation or a declaration. It arrived the way water erodes stone, not through force but through repetition, through the same small thing happening often enough that the shape of the surface eventually changed. Marcus stopped asking her opinion at dinner about decisions at work. He had always done that, brought problems home, talked them through with her over food, gone back the next day with a cleaner version of what they'd worked out together. Then in the autumn after Edmund's funeral, he simply stopped. The problems still came home with him. He just stopped bringing them to the table. He began introducing her differently. She noticed it first at a board dinner in September, when a man she had met twice before extended his hand, and Marcus said, "My wife," with the same neutral brevity he might have used for the name of a hotel. Not Caroline. Not Caroline Alderman. Just the category. She shook the man's hand and smiled and said nothing. And later she wondered if she had imagined the shift in weight the phrasing carried. She had not imagined it. Gloria Webb noticed the shift and moved toward it the way a compass moves toward north, instinctively, without apparent effort. Marcus's mother had never been unkind to Caroline in any way that could be named cleanly. Her cruelty was a thing of grammar. The slightly too long pause before agreeing with something Caroline said. The compliment that arrived carrying a subordinate clause. At a luncheon in October, Gloria looked at Caroline across a white tablecloth and said, with the warmth of genuine concern, "You know, darling, I do worry about how you're managing. You were so dependent on Edmund. Some women just don't know how to find their footing after a loss like that." She patted Caroline's hand. The other women at the table nodded with sympathy. Caroline said she was managing well, thank you. Gloria tilted her head at a precise angle that communicated, without words, that she doubted it. What Gloria was building, Caroline would understand later, was a record, not a conscious one. Gloria was not a strategist in that way. She was simply a woman who had spent 71 years constructing a version of reality in which her son was the most capable person in any room, and anyone who had contributed to his success needed to be retroactively minimized so the architecture held. Caroline's father had been too present, too respected, and too obviously foundational for Gloria to touch while he lived. Now he was gone. Now the work could begin. Then something shifted, and it was quieter than Gloria's campaign and more corrosive. Renata Solis had joined Nexigen as Director of Communications in 2021, and Caroline had met her at a dozen events before Edmund's death without registering her as anything other than competent and present. She was both of those things. She entered rooms with the specific forward energy of a woman who had decided early in her career that attention was a resource, and she intended to use it well. At the events Caroline attended as Marcus's wife in the autumn and winter of 2023, Renata was always there, managing press arrangements, coordinating seating, moving through the room with the authority of someone who knew exactly where everything was. She was good at her job. That was not what Caroline noticed first. What Caroline noticed first was Marcus's shoulders, the way they changed when Renata came near. A slight, involuntary adjustment, the body doing something the face was too controlled to show. She noticed it once and filed it without a label, the way a trained attorney files anything that might become relevant later. She noticed it again 3 weeks later at a press event in River North, and this time the label presented itself clearly, and she chose not to use it. She went to grief counseling. She sat across from Dr. Osei in the office on North Michigan Avenue every other Tuesday and talked about her father, about the house in Evanston, about the difficulty of watching something end. She said almost nothing about Marcus, not because she was protecting him, because saying it aloud would have forced a decision she was not ready to make, and she had learned from her father that decisions made before you are ready are usually the wrong ones. The board dinner was in October. Candle-lit, 60 people, the private room at a restaurant on East Wacker Drive, where Nexigen held its larger client events. Halfway through the main course, Marcus stood without being asked and raised his glass, and the table went quiet in the way tables do when the most important person in the room decides to speak. He thanked the board. He thanked the leadership team. He talked about vision and courage and the kind of people who build companies from nothing into something that lasts. Edmund had been dead for 4 months. His name did not appear in the toast. Caroline was sitting 6 seats to Marcus's left. Her name did not appear either. She did not look up from her plate when Marcus spoke. She looked up once near the end of the toast, when the room's attention had shifted toward the back wall, and she found Renata Solis standing near the service entrance, watching Marcus with an expression that was not professional. Marcus, glass still raised, caught Renata's eye across the room and held it for exactly 1 beat longer than he held anyone else's. He didn't notice Caroline watching. He didn't notice much about Caroline at all in those months. She drove herself home. She pulled into the garage on North Burling Street and turned the engine off and sat in the dark car and looked at the wall in front of her. The garage smelled of cold concrete and engine warmth. She sat there for 11 minutes. She counted them. Then she picked up her bag and went inside. The first thing Marcus took was the easy thing. That is often how it begins. In the second week of February, Caroline received a notification from Chase Private Client that her name had been removed as a joint account holder from the Webb Alderman investment portfolio, account number ending in 7741. The email was administrative in tone and arrived at 6:43 in the morning before Marcus had left for work. She read it at the kitchen table with her coffee and did not look up when he came downstairs. He mentioned it that evening, briefly, the way he mentioned things he had already decided. "I'm simplifying the financial structure," he said, standing at the counter with his phone in his hand. "It's cleaner this way. Everything's still there." He did not say what everything meant. She did not ask. She understood with the precise comprehension of a woman trained in corporate law that the vocabulary of simplification was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Within the month, the household maintenance account, the one she had managed for 11 years, the one that ran the townhouse and the children's expenses, and the small, necessary logistics of a life, was reduced from its standing balance of $14,000 to $4,000. Marcus offered no explanation for this either. The reduction simply appeared in her account summary one Tuesday morning, like a fact about the weather. Caroline began keeping a grocery list for the first time in her marriage, not because she had to count carefully yet, but because she understood she might need to, and she had always believed that preparation was a form of dignity. Gloria arrived for the first time unannounced on a Thursday afternoon in late February, letting herself in with the key Marcus had given her the previous autumn, a key Caroline had not been told about. She brought tulips. She moved through the kitchen, touching things lightly, the countertop, the cabinet handles, the window latch above the sink. She said she had been thinking the kitchen might benefit from new hardware. "Something more modern," she said, with the warmth of a woman suggesting a haircut. "The brass is very 90s, darling. Marcus always found it a bit heavy." Caroline made tea. She did not look at the cabinet handles. She set Gloria's cup down in front of her and said that she hadn't noticed. What Gloria was doing, the narration can say plainly, was measuring for curtains. She returned twice more in March, each time with the same light touch, the same vocabulary of improvement, the same sidelong references to what Marcus preferred. Once unprompted, she mentioned that Renata had wonderful taste in interiors. She said it the way someone drops a stone into water, not to make a point, but to watch the surface. Caroline's face did not change. Her hands were still around her mug. It was in March that Caroline found the receipt. Marcus had left his jacket on the chair in the entryway, a dark wool overcoat she had given him for his birthday 3 years before. And when she moved it to the hook, an envelope slipped from the inside pocket and fell to the floor. It was a dinner receipt from Oriole on West Walton Street, dated a Saturday in January when Marcus had been, he told her, at a strategy weekend in Milwaukee. The amount was $840. The table had been for two. She stood in the entryway for a moment with the receipt in her hand. Then she walked to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the refrigerator, and took down a gray archival box that had belonged to her mother. Solid cardboard, hinged lid, the kind built to last. She had kept it for years out of sentiment. She photographed the receipt with her phone, placed the original back in the envelope, returned the envelope to the jacket pocket, and hung the coat on the hook. She put her phone in the box. The box went back in the cabinet. That was how it started. From that point, the box acquired contents the way patient things do, slowly, without announcement. Bank notifications, a calendar screenshot, a hotel reward statement that arrived in a paper envelope addressed to Marcus and opened, as she always opened household mail by Carolyn. She did not analyze the contents. She did not construct arguments from them. She simply documented with the disciplined neutrality of someone who understood that facts are most powerful when they are simply allowed to exist. The cardiac event happened on a Tuesday in April. She had been tired for weeks in the way that accumulates without announcing itself. The tiredness of sustained attention, of grief still moving through her body, of a house that was being emptied by degrees while she stood inside it. She was at the kitchen table when her chest tightened, in a way that was different from the ordinary tightness she had come to expect, and she called the number Dr. Priya Mehta had given her at a routine appointment the previous year and described what she felt, and Dr. Mehta told her to come in. She was admitted to Northwestern Memorial. She was there for 2 nights. A nurse named Angela Morris checked her vitals every 4 hours, with the efficient kindness of someone who had done this thousands of times and still meant it. The space beside Caroline's bed where a family member might have sat remained empty. A fruit basket arrived the first afternoon with a card that said, in Marcus's assistant's handwriting, "Thinking of you. Get well soon." His assistant's cell number was written beneath. Dr. Mehta noted the absence in her file without commentary. Angela Morris noted it in the nursing record with the same neutral language. Patient has had no visitors during admission. Both documents went into Caroline's medical record. Neither woman said anything to Caroline about it. There are things that are understood without being said, and the absence of a husband from a hospital bed is one of them. On the morning of the second day, Caroline lay in the adjustable bed, with the winter light coming through the window at a low angle, and thought about her father. She thought about the 3-ring binder on the shelf in Evanston. She thought about Howard Finch's voice on the phone the previous month, the way he had used the word absolute twice, the way he had said your father was quite clear about his reasons. She thought about the phone call she had not yet made to Simone Park. Her hands were still on the sheet in front of her, the hospital bracelet loose on her left wrist. She made a decision that morning. Not about action. The time for that had not arrived. About readiness. She decided she was ready to be ready, which was its own kind of threshold. She was discharged on a Thursday afternoon. She carried her own bag through the hospital lobby, past the reception desk, and through the sliding glass doors to the parking structure where her car had been sitting for 2 days. The discharge coordinator, a young man named Daniel Reyes, walked her to the elevator and offered to help with her bag. She said she had it. The elevator opened. She stepped in. She drove herself home on the Eisenhower in late afternoon traffic, the city gray and wet outside the window, and pulled into the garage on North Burling Street. She walked into the kitchen. On the counter, in a tall crystal vase she had never seen before, was an arrangement of white peonies and eucalyptus, dense and architectural, the kind of arrangement that costs a certain amount and is meant to communicate something about the giver's taste. A small card was tucked into the stems. Gloria's handwriting. "Thinking of you, darling." The vase itself had clearly been brought and left deliberately. It was too large for any surface in the kitchen, except the one where Caroline kept her cookbooks, which had been moved to make room for it. Caroline stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She looked at the vase. She looked at where her cookbooks had been stacked, now pushed to the far end of the counter. She set her bag down. She put the kettle on. She did not move the vase. Instead, she went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the gray archival box. She added the hospital discharge paperwork to its contents. Date, location, duration of stay. She closed the lid. She put it back. The board vote was in 3 weeks. She already knew what she was going to do. 3 weeks after the board vote was scheduled, on a Tuesday morning in late April, Caroline put on the navy dress she had been keeping for this occasion. Not because it was flattering, in the way that word is usually meant, but because it was serious and quiet, and it had been her mother's favorite color. And she drove to the Nexigen building on West Wacker Drive and took the elevator to the 31st floor and sat in the 3rd row of the observer gallery without saying anything to anyone. The boardroom was below the gallery level, separated by a glass partition. She could see the full table, 14 chairs, 12 men and 2 women, arranged in the specific geometry of institutional authority. She had been in rooms like this before. Not this room, but this kind, when she was still practicing corporate law. And she understood them as she understood most things, through their structure, which told you everything about what they were designed to produce. Marcus was at the head of the table. He was wearing the dark charcoal suit he kept for significant occasions, and he was composed in the way he was always composed in professional settings. Still, authoritative, carrying himself with the settled ease of a man who had arranged for the outcome in advance. Renata Solis stood near the back of the room, managing the 2-person press setup with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this day as thoroughly as Marcus had. She wore a dark blazer and moved between the cameras and the communications team with the quiet sureness of a woman who knew exactly what her position in the room meant. Gloria had found Caroline's seat before Caroline did. She was already settled when Caroline arrived, wearing a cream jacket and the expression of a woman attending a coronation she had helped engineer. She reached over and patted Caroline's hand. "This is the beginning of things being as they should be," she said, in the warm, confiding tone she used for statements she intended to land. Caroline looked through the glass at the table below. She said nothing. The vote was not dramatic. It rarely is, when the outcome has already been arranged. Arthur Lim read the motion. The board confirmed. Marcus accepted with a brief, measured statement about the future. Several people stood. He stood to receive them. Caroline applauded with her hands in her lap, quietly the way one applauds from a gallery. The irony was not lost on the narrator or on anyone who had been listening carefully. While the room below filled with the sound of congratulation, the woman in the navy dress in the 3rd row of the observer gallery held in trust the single instrument that made the vote she had just witnessed a legal nullity. She had held it for 6 weeks. She would hold it a little longer. The announcement dinner was at the Langham Hotel on North Wabash Avenue, in a private dining room on the 5th floor that held 80 people, and had been arranged by Renata's communications team with the clean, expensive precision of a product launch. Caroline had been informed of the dinner, not invited. The distinction arrived in the form of a single line in Marcus's calendar that she had seen while looking for something else. She came because Marcus had mentioned it once, offhandedly, as something she should attend. The subtext was that her presence was useful. She understood that. She went. The table had been arranged with the unspoken precision of a room that has decided where the weight lies. Marcus sat at the center of the long side, flanked by Arthur Lim and a board member named Peter Graves, who had been with Nexigen for 19 years. Renata was at the head table in the seat to Marcus's left, where a spouse customarily sat. Caroline had been placed at the far end, between 2 people she had met twice, and whose names she would not remember because they did not try to remember hers. She did not look at Renata's seat for more than a moment. She noted it the way she noted all relevant facts, and then she turned her attention to her dinner. Marcus gave a toast at the midpoint of the meal. He spoke well. He always had. He talked about Nexigen's future, about the responsibility of leadership, about the privilege of being trusted with something that mattered. Edmund Alderman's name appeared once, briefly in a subordinate clause about the company's founding legacy, alongside two other names, sandwiched in a sentence that moved quickly past its subject. Caroline's name did not appear at all. She was in the room, 8 seats away, and her name was not in the speech. She raised her glass when the room raised theirs. She took a small sip. Shortly after the toast, a board member named David Cho approached Marcus with the congratulatory energy of a man who had voted correctly and wanted credit for it. He glanced at Caroline as she stood nearby, the reflexive acknowledgement of a person registering another person's presence. Marcus looked at her once, with the flat assessment of a man completing an administrative task, and said, "This is my soon-to-be ex." David Cho's expression moved through 3 things quickly: recognition, discomfort, and the decision to look back at Marcus and continue the conversation as though he had not heard it. Gloria, seated 2 chairs away, smiled at her water glass. Not at Caroline, at the glass. It was, in its way, a precise performance. Caroline's hands were at her sides. Her breath moved through her steadily. She excused herself in a few moments and returned to her seat and finished her dinner, and she applauded every subsequent toast, and she spoke pleasantly to the 2 people beside her. And when the evening ended, she collected her coat from the coat check and drove herself home on Lakeshore Drive with the radio off. She parked in the garage. She walked into the kitchen. She opened her laptop on the kitchen table, the same chair, and she opened the email from Howard Finch that she had read 14 times, and she read it a 15th time, slowly, every word. She thought about her father's voice. She thought about the way he said her name when he wanted her to remember something. Not louder, but more precisely, the way you focus a lens. She closed the laptop. She placed her palm flat on the table. The house was empty and very still. She sat there for a long time, not in grief, not in the old patient endurance that had kept her in rooms like this one for months. Something had shifted, quietly, internally, the way a lock disengages. She was not deciding whether to act. She had already decided in a hospital bed 3 weeks ago. She was simply sitting with the knowledge of what came next, letting it settle into the right shape. The navy dress was still on. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. And for the first time in a very long time, Caroline Alderman Webb did not feel like a woman enduring something. She felt like a woman on the last night before the morning she had been waiting for. She waited 2 days after the dinner before she opened the box. Not from hesitation. From the same deliberateness that had governed everything she had done in the past 6 weeks. The understanding that decisions made in the immediate aftermath of events carry the emotional temperature of those events inside them. And she had no interest in acting from temperature. She had watched what happened to people who move fast and loud and from the center of their own pain. She had watched Marcus do it for years, accelerating through each doubt before it could take root and ask questions. She had no intention of becoming that. On the 3rd morning of Thursday, she woke at 6 and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the garden. The one she had planted 3 springs ago, the one Gloria had suggested in April, might benefit from a redesign. The tulips from Gloria's vase, still on the counter, had begun to drop their petals. She noted this without feeling anything in particular about it. Then she went to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down the gray archival box and carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. She did not review the contents with urgency. She laid them out in order, the way she had been trained, the way her mind naturally worked when it had a problem worth solving. The Chase account notification from February, the reduced household account summary, the photographs she had taken of the Oriole receipt in the hotel reward statement, the printout of the calendar entries she had captured in March, the hospital discharge paperwork from Northwestern Memorial dated April 14th. Each one dated, each one specific, arranged from left to right across the table in the quiet kitchen of a house that had been dismantled around her in such careful increments that most people would not have noticed it happening. She noticed it. She had noticed each piece as it arrived. She had simply waited until she had enough of them to see the whole shape. Beneath the evidence documents, in a manila folder Howard Finch had sent by courier in February, was the trust documentation. The Alderman Family Trust, the Class A Founders Share Instrument, the 1987 Charter Clause. The amendment dated 3 months before Edmund's death, signed with the blue Waterman pen that was now in a casket in Rose Hill Cemetery in Evanston. She lifted the amendment page and read the margin note her father had written beside the Class A clause, in the cramped, particular script she had known all her life. For Caroline. She'll know. She set the page down. She sat with it for a moment. Her father had not left her a weapon. That was what she understood now, fully in a way she hadn't when Howard had first read her the clause over the phone. A weapon is something you use against someone. What Edmund had left her was a responsibility, the authority to determine whether the company he had built with a pharmacist's salary and a blue pen in 30 years of his life would be led with integrity. He had trusted her to make that determination, not because she was his daughter, because he knew what she had seen and what she was and what she would do when she was ready. She was ready. She called Howard Finch at 8:45. He answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting her. "I have one question," she said. "Go ahead." "When I exercise the Class A instrument to invoke the leadership review provision, is the notification filed with the board secretary or directly with the general counsel?" "Board secretary," Howard said, "with a copy to general counsel simultaneously. Simone's team will handle the exact protocol." "Thank you, Howard." "Caroline." A pause, just long enough. "Your father was a precise man." "I know," she said. "I'll talk to you soon." She ended the call. Then she sat for a moment longer with Edmund's words in the margin of a page that was now 37 years old, written by a man who had understood that documents outlast rooms, that the name on the founding instrument is the name the building remembers, and that everything else, the eulogies and the toasts and the standing ovations and the dinners where you are seated at the far end of a table in a room you were never supposed to enter, everything else is just noise. She called Simone Park at 9. Simone's assistant put her through without asking the nature of the call, which meant Simone had been expecting her too. "I'm ready to proceed," Caroline said. "I'll need your confirmation on the filing timeline. I'd recommend 4 weeks from today. That gives us time to complete the forensic review and consolidate the conflict of interest documentation." 4 weeks is fine. "Are you certain you want to move forward?" "Yes." Simone's response was brief and immediate. "Then I'll begin preparing the notice. I'll send you the draft for review by end of week." That was the conversation. 43 seconds. Caroline set her phone face down on the table and looked at the documents spread before her. The full architecture of the last several months laid out in chronological order on a kitchen table in a house that had been, in every way that mattered, her home. And she felt something in her chest settle into a new arrangement. Not a hardening, not the closing of a door. More like the moment in a long calculation when the numbers finally balance, when the equation resolves. And you can see clearly that the answer was always there, waiting for you to work down to it. She did not put the box away. She stacked the documents neatly, replaced the lid, and left it on the table where she could see it. That evening, Gloria's charity event was held at a reception hall on East Illinois Street, a benefit for a children's hospital that Gloria had chaired for 6 consecutive years, which meant the room was full of people who knew Gloria and had arrived prepared to agree with her about things. Marcus was not there. He was traveling. Caroline attended because she had said she would, and because she had always been, at her core, a woman who did what she said she would do. She moved through the room for 90 minutes. She spoke with people she had known for years. She was warm and present and gave no indication of anything except that she was glad to be there. Gloria watched her from across the room twice, the watchful attention of a woman trying to read a surface that had become, recently, impossible to read. Caroline smiled when she caught Gloria's eye. Gloria smiled back. Neither smile contained anything the other woman could use. On the drive home, Caroline thought about nothing in particular. She parked in the garage. She walked into the kitchen. The box was still on the table where she had left it. She did not move it. She made tea and went to bed. 4 weeks later, Simone Park's notice of emergency board session, filed on behalf of the Alderman Family Trust and citing the Class A founder's share of Nexagen Pharmaceuticals, arrived at the desk of the board secretary at 9:17 in the morning. By 9:45, 3 of the 14 board members had called their assistants to ask what a Class A founder's share was. By 10, the General Counsel had opened the 1987 charter and begun to read. The morning of the board session was clear and cold, the kind of Chicago morning that arrives in late spring like a final argument from winter. Carolyn dressed in a gray blazer and drove to West Wacker Drive and took the elevator to the 31st floor for the second time in 5 weeks. This time, she was not in the gallery. This time, she walked directly into the boardroom. Marcus Webb arrived at the 31st floor at 8:52, 8 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin, because arriving early to a room you control is a way of owning it before anyone else enters. His attorney, a man named Gerald Price of Catton Mook and Rosamond, walked beside him with the measured confidence of someone who had reviewed the filing and found it wanting. They had discussed it twice, once by phone the previous evening and once in the elevator on the way up. Gerald's assessment had not changed. Creative filing, aggressive positioning, no real teeth. A grieving woman and a motivated attorney looking for leverage in a divorce. The board would hear it, find it without merit, and move on. Marcus took the chair at the head of the table. He straightened his jacket. He accepted a cup of coffee from the administrative assistant who brought one without being asked, because she had learned in 3 years what he expected in a room. He set the cup to his right and opened his folder and reviewed the session agenda with the composed attention of a man performing thoroughness for an audience that hadn't arrived yet. The room filled gradually. Arthur Lim took his seat to Marcus's left. The other board members settled in around the table in the specific arrangement of people who have received a document they don't fully understand and are waiting for someone to explain it. David Cho, who had been at the announcement dinner, sat midway down the table and did not look toward the door. Nexigen's general counsel, a careful man named Stephen Pratt, sat at the far end with a printed copy of the 1987 founding charter open in front of him. He had been reviewing it since 7 that morning. He had not said much to anyone since approximately 7:40. Then something shifted in the room's atmosphere, a subtle change in attention, a collective reorientation toward the door. And Caroline walked in. She entered with Simone Park on her left and 2 associates from Park and Kwan carrying document cases on her right. She was wearing the gray blazer. Her dark hair was pulled back. She moved without hurry to the seat across the table from Marcus and sat down and placed her hands flat on the surface in front of her. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at Simone, who set a 12-page brief on the table and opened it without preamble. "Thank you for convening on short notice," Simone said. "Not warmth, information. We'll begin." Marcus's expression held. His attorneys held. The board waited. Simone placed the first document in the center of the table, a certified copy of the Alderman Family Trust Instrument, bearing Howard Finch's notarization and the date of Edmund Alderman's signature. Beside it, she placed the trust amendment, dated 3 months before Edmund's death, naming Caroline Ruth Alderman as sole successor trustee. Beside that, she placed the Class A Founder's Share Certificate, a single page, clean and formal, the language precise and old. The Alderman Family Trust is the sole holder of the Class A Founder's Share of Nexigen Pharmaceuticals, Simone said. That instrument was created in the 1987 founding charter by Edmund Alderman at incorporation. The charter language is on page 3 of your brief. She waited while the room turned to page 3. Section 4.1b. One will read it aloud. No appointment, removal, or change of executive leadership shall be valid or effective without the written ratification of the Class A Founder's shareholder. Such ratification is required prior to any board vote taking effect. The room went silent in a particular way, not the silence of attention, but the silence of comprehension arriving at an unwelcome destination. Phones appeared. Board members began typing. Several leaned toward each other and said nothing aloud. Stephen Pratt turned to page 4 of the charter and ran his finger down the text with the careful focus of a man hoping to find a counter-argument and not finding one. Every CEO appointment in Nexigen's history required Class A ratification, Simone continued. All prior appointments were made while Edmund Alderman held the trust. He ratified his own decisions. The instrument was never exercised against an appointment because he never appointed someone he didn't intend to ratify. She paused. The board's vote of 4 weeks ago was not ratified. No Class A approval was sought because no one in this room knew to seek it. Mr. Webb's appointment has been structurally void since the moment of the vote. Marcus's hand moved fractionally on the table. His attorney placed 2 fingers lightly on his forearm. Marcus was still. Arthur Lim looked at Stephen Pratt. Stephen Pratt looked at the charter. He did not look up. Simone placed the second set of documents on the table. The secondary matter. Her voice did not change register. A forensic accounting review commissioned by the Alderman Family Trust, completed by Meridian Forensic Group Chicago, dated this week. In the 6 months prior to the board vote, Nexagen's subsidiary NXG Media Solutions directed $2.3 million in communications ad inventory purchases to Meridian Media Partners, a Chicago-based digital firm. Renata Solis, Nexagen's Director of Communications, holds a 22% equity stake in Meridian Media Partners. That interest was not disclosed to the board at any point during her tenure. The conflict of interest was not filed. The board members looked at each other, not at Marcus, at each other, the way people look when they are calculating what they knew, and when they knew it and whether that calculation protects them. David Cho studied the table in front of him. He was, the narration notes, the board member who had not known what to do at the announcement dinner when Marcus called Caroline his soon-to-be ex, while she stood 3 feet away. He knew what to do now. He turned to Arthur Lim and gave a small, definitive nod. Arthur Lim called the recess at 9:27. The board returned at 9:49. Arthur did not look at Marcus when he read the motion. The governance review was opened. Marcus's access credentials, building, network, executive suite, were deactivated by the IT administrator at 9:51, while Marcus was still in the room. The administrator had been waiting for the instruction. Upstairs on the same floor, in the communications suite 300 feet down the corridor, Renata Solis had received a call from Stephen Pratt's office at 9:31. The call lasted 4 minutes. By 9:45, she had her personal items in a canvas tote bag she kept under her desk. By 10, she had cleared her parking space in the building garage. The irony is this. She left the building through the same lobby where Edmund Alderman's founding document hung framed beside the reception desk, and she did not look at it. Marcus attempted to speak once, just before Arthur read the motion. Gerald Price stopped him with a word and a look. There was nothing to say that would not compound the situation. Marcus understood this. He sat with his hands still and his face arranged carefully and said nothing, which was the most controlled he had been in the room all morning. What he was experiencing in those minutes was not rage. The narration can say that with certainty. It was something older and quieter and more total. The specific devastation of a man realizing that the story he had been telling himself for 12 years, the one in which he was the architect of his own position, had just been shown to be built on a document he had never read, held by a woman he had dismissed at a dinner 6 weeks ago, in a room she owned without his knowing. He looked at Caroline once, directly, across the table, across everything. She met his eyes. She did not look away. Her hands were still flat on the table. Her expression did not change. "You needed my signature, Marcus," she said, quiet, level, carrying the full weight of 12 years in 8 words. "You always did." The room did not respond. Simone closed her document folder with a soft, final sound. The session concluded at 10:14. Caroline and Simone walked to the elevator together. Simone pressed the button. The doors opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. Caroline looked straight ahead at her own reflection in the brushed steel panel, and she saw a woman in a gray blazer whose name was on a document that would outlast every room she had ever been dismissed from. She did not smile. She did not need to. She was simply, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she was supposed to be. What happened next did not happen slowly. That is worth saying. The world Marcus Webb had constructed over 12 years did not unwind gradually the way marriages do. It came apart the way structures come apart when the load-bearing element is removed, quickly and all at once, and in a specific order that made the sequence feel almost architectural. Marcus submitted his formal resignation to the board 7 days after the session. He chose resignation over governance review because his attorney, Gerald Price, was direct about the calculus. A review would produce a public record, and a public record would follow him. He signed the letter at Gerald's office on North LaSalle Street on a Tuesday morning and left without speaking to anyone at Nexigen. His access credentials had already been deactivated. There was nothing left to collect. Without Nexigen, his professional identity had no architecture. He had spent 12 years building a career inside a house Edmund Alderman built, calling it his own. And when the house was no longer available to him, he discovered he did not know where else to stand. His calls to Simone Park, routed through his attorney, were handled efficiently and without sentiment. Simone handled everything efficiently and without sentiment. That was what she was for. He called Caroline's number once. She watched it ring from across the room. She did not answer. She did not call back. There was nothing to say that documents had not already said more precisely. Gloria withdrew from the townhouse she had been measuring for 3 months. Her last appearance in the story is this. She arrived on a Wednesday to retrieve the crystal vase she had brought when Caroline came home from the hospital. She rang the bell. No one answered. She left without the vase. It was still on the kitchen counter, empty now, the peonies long since composted. Caroline donated it to a resale shop on North Clark Street the following week without giving it a second thought. Renata Solis. The Meridian Media Partners audit, launched by Nexigen's audit committee in the week following the governance session, ran for 6 weeks and produced a finding that was referred to the company's legal team and documented in the governance record. Renata did not contest it. She had already relocated to New York by then, where she had accepted a communications role at a firm that did not know her name yet and would not learn it from Nexigen. She was very good at her job. She would find a new architecture to inhabit. She always did. The Nexigen share price dipped 4% in the week following the governance review and recovered fully within 30 days when the board announced restructured leadership and a governance transparency initiative. The Wall Street Journal ran a brief item. It did not mention Caroline by name. The board corrected this in their internal announcement, which named Caroline Alderman as a newly appointed non-executive director and acknowledged the Alderman Family Trust's foundational role in the company's history. She attended her first board meeting in June. She sat at the far end of the table, the chair that had always been there, that had never had her name on it before. She read the agenda. She asked 2 questions. Both were about long-term governance structure. The room took notes on both of them. The divorce settlement was finalized in July. The narration will not detail its terms, because its terms are not the point of the story. It was final. It was fair. It reflected, as Simone Park had told her it would, the structural reality of their respective positions. Caroline signed it at Howard Finch's office on a Friday afternoon and drove to Evanston for dinner with her children, who had been staying with Margaret through the final proceedings, and who were, the narration is glad to report, entirely fine. Resilient in the specific way of children whose primary parent has remained steady throughout the earthquake. The scene softened into something quieter after that. Caroline sold the townhouse on North Burling Street in September. She bought a smaller apartment on Hinman Avenue in Evanston, 3 blocks from the house she grew up in, where Edmund's study was still intact, and his books were still on the shelves, and the backyard still had the garden Margaret tended with the patience of someone who understood that things take the time they take. 6 months after the board session, on a Sunday morning in early November, when the city outside was quiet and the light came in low and pale through the balcony door, Caroline retrieved Edmund's original copy of the Nexigen founding charter from the shelf where she had placed it when she moved in. The 3-ring binder, photocopied pages, coffee-stained cover, Edmund's handwriting filling the margins in blue ink. She carried it to the small table on the balcony and sat down and opened it. She read through it slowly, the way she read everything that mattered: the preamble, the incorporation articles, the governance provisions she had studied with Howard Finch, whose language she now knew as well as her own name. She turned pages with the unhurried attention of a woman with nowhere to be. She reached page 7, the Class A clause. She had read it dozens of times in the past year. In Howard's office, on her kitchen table at midnight, in the gray archival box by lamplight. She knew every word, but she had never read this copy, Edmund's copy, the one he had held in the pharmacy on Dempster Street when Gerald Strauss first explained what the clause meant, 37 years ago. In the margin beside it, in the cramped, particular script she had known all her life, In the same blue ink as the Waterman pen that was now in a casket in Rose Hill Cemetery were 5 words she had not seen before. For Caroline, she'll know. Her breath moved through her, steady and complete. She held the page for a long moment. The name that signs the founding document is the name the building remembers, sweetheart. Everything else is just noise. She had understood it as a lesson about permanence once. Then she had understood it as a lesson about power. Now, reading it in her father's handwriting in the margin of the document he had carried for 37 years, she understood what it had always been. It was not a lesson. It was not a strategy. It was a father who had known his daughter completely, who had seen without being told what was happening to her, and who had done the only thing a man like Edmund Alderman knew how to do. He had written her name on something that would last. He didn't arm her. He trusted her. He simply made sure that when she was ready, the instrument would be there, signed, certified, irrevocable, waiting. This story is not really about wealth. It is not about documents or governance or the legal architecture of a founding charter. It is about the specific, irreplaceable thing that a parent who truly knows their child can do. They can look ahead down the road and clear one stone from the path, quietly without fanfare, and walk away trusting their child to find it when they need it. And it is about what happens when you spend years being told, in 100 small ways, that you are not worth paying attention to. And the only person who ever really saw you has left something behind to prove them wrong. If someone in your life has ever quietly prepared the ground for you, if someone has ever believed in you before you believed in yourself, tell us about them in the comments. We would love to hear. And wherever in the world you are watching this, whether it's morning or midnight, whether you're on a commute or lying in the dark, thank you for being here. Carolyn closed the binder. She set it on the table in front of her and looked out at the city. Evanston in November. The trees had lost most of their leaves. The street below was empty and still. She was not celebrating. She was not thinking about what had been done to her, or what had been restored, or what the year behind her had cost. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which is the privilege of a woman who has finished the work. She was simply sitting still in a world that had returned, at last, to its correct proportions. In her father's handwriting, 5 words waited on the page behind her, patient as documents always are. The city was quiet. She let it be.